Activist Greta Thunberg has been cleared of breaking the law when she refused to follow police orders to leave a protest at a London oil conference last year. There was applause in court as the judge acquitted her and her 4 co-defendants, saying there was not enough evidence against them and the order to disperse was unclear. The Swedish environmentalist has been arrested several times in the last year. So are her tactics changing, or are the authorities losing patience? Ria Chatterjee reports.
If Greta Thunberg was feeling confident at lunchtime, then she was right to be. The case against her and 4 other protesters was thrown out of court. The conditions imposed on them by the police deemed unclear by the judge, an energy that Greta and her gang seem to embrace today.
We really like frogs.
Here's the moment she was arrested last year. Oil executives had been meeting inside a fancy hotel last October for a conference. She and 4 others were accused of breaching Section 14 of the Public Order Act by blocking the entrance to the hotel. But where's the evidence, boomed the judge today. No witness statements, he said. No evidence of vehicles being impeded, interference with emergency services, or risk to life.
We must remember who the real enemy is. What are we defending? Who are our laws meant to protect?
No new oil, no new gas. We don't want a climate crash.
The judge described the law as unclear, uncertain and unlawful in this particular case. And it raises bigger questions about the Public Order Act and the criminalisation of protest. The defendants today could have been fined £2,500, but in the worst case scenario, protesters deemed to be causing a public nuisance could face a jail sentence of up to 10 years.
Our right to protest is under pressure right now. I think people will feel like they can't go along to a protest because any protest could be deemed too much disruption for whichever particular officer is at the scene that day, and it is going to affect our rights to peacefully protest, which is a crucial part of democracy.
Adani recently invested 16 billion Australian dollars into a new coal mine. Is that what you stand for as the Science Museum?
The activists' drive for accountability seems unfazed by the threat of legal repercussions. This was last night at the Science Museum. The coal giant Adani sponsors the museum's Green Energy Gallery, which critics argue is hypocritical.
Yeah, I'm going to wrap things up. Thanks so much.
They should be allowed an opportunity to respond.
Yeah, ask the member of the panel how they feel.
Shame on you!
A few months ago, Greta was at the Malmö District Court in Sweden, fined €200 for disobeying police during a protest. Within hours, she was back at it. Today, at Westminster Magistrates Court in London, if she was feeling nervous, she didn't show it. The judge described the protest last October as peaceful, civilised and non-violent. Some of his summing up, criticising the lawyers for the police for poor evidence, was met with hysterics from the public gallery. The Metropolitan Police says it has to balance the right to protest with Londoners who are fed up with repeated, serious disruption. In the final moments of court, there were loud cheers when the judge turned to the protesters and told them they were free to go.
Katie Watts is a lawyer for the human rights organisation Liberty, which is taking the Home Secretary to court later this month for forcing through the anti-protest laws used in court today, which Parliament had previously rejected. She told me why she thought the judgment in this case is so significant.
The findings of the judge that the condition which had been imposed on the protest was so vague show that these new powers which have been handed to the police are so broad that they are unworkable in practice. They hand the police vast powers to impose conditions on protests, to control protests, and set the threshold for which the police can do that at an extremely low bar.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because he said that no cars were being impeded, no emergency vehicles were being held up, there was no threat to life. The reality is that is not always the case with protests, particularly as we've seen with climate protesters. There has to be some way to police these.
What's happened in this case is that the police were relying on new powers introduced by the Home Secretary back last summer, which have lowered the threshold for when the police can control protests from a level of serious disruption to any impact which is more than minor. And so what we saw in this case was that the impact on the local area, on the community, was limited really to people being delayed in accessing this fossil fuel conference.
But as I say, that's not always the case, is it? Particularly with climate protests. We've seen a lot of unhappiness among the public because they are cars are impeded from going about their business. Emergency vehicles sometimes slow down, certainly.
Of course, but these laws don't just apply to climate protesters, they apply to us all. We've all got the right to stand up for what we believe in, to make our voices heard on issues that matter to us. Liberty are challenging those new laws in court. The High Court will hear our case next month. We are arguing that the Home Secretary had no power to lower the threshold from serious disruption to more than minor. That same change had been explicitly rejected by Parliament earlier last year and was brought back in through the back door by secondary legislation mere months later. We're arguing that that was unlawful and that the new laws should be scrapped.
You'll be aware that the current government have moved to say that they believe, there should be more limits on protests. The police should have that lower threshold. The chances of change, how optimistic are you?
Well, this is all obviously happening in the climate of a wide, sweeping crackdown on protest from the government. In the last 2 years, we've seen 2 new protest acts passed through Parliament, which hand the police far greater powers and which limit all of our rights to stand up and have our voices heard. So, yes, it is a deeply concerning time for free expression and for the right to protest. But in this case, we say that what the government has done has gone too far and is undemocratic and unconstitutional to change the law in this way.
I mean, over the last couple of months, we've seen thousands and thousands of people take to the streets all over the country, actually, to express their solidarity for the people of Gaza, for Palestinians, broadly peaceful. People can protest in this country. The law allows them to protest.
Yeah, and I think it's been really interesting to see the rhetoric around those Palestine solidarity protests, which is that we are seeing deeply concerning rhetoric, again, from the government and from the Home Secretary, over what is and is not lawful when it comes to the right to protest.
But you're broadly not seeing the police go in and arrest hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of protesters.
No, and that's what's interesting, is that we're seeing that rhetoric from the Home Secretary, but in practice, those protests have been free from disruption and have enabled hundreds of thousands of people to go out and express solidarity with Palestine.
But that suggests the law's working, doesn't it?
Well, I think we can see from this case that we're talking about today that the law is not working, that in some cases we're seeing protesters being arrested for behaving in a completely lawful way due to the very vague powers which the police have to control their rights.
Katie Watts, thanks very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Now, in southern